Venus flytraps are a species that has a very restricted range. Only within 90 miles of Wilmington, North Carolina can you find flytraps. They grow in very specific habitat. It's very poor, sandy, wet soils that sometimes are wet and sometimes are dry. And those habitats are pretty restricted, both in North and South Carolina. We used to think that the biggest reason we were losing flytraps was because of poaching, people illegally stealing them from the property of others. But we now know that the real threat is habitat loss, particularly in the two coastal counties, one in North Carolina and one in South Carolina. Those are two of the rapidly growing counties in the southeast, and those are where we find most of the flytraps. So we're losing flytraps today because of habitat loss. And there are two aspects to habitat loss. One is the actual putting a building or a road on top of the habitat, and the other is to have buildings and roads nearby, and the roads frequently dewater or drain an area, which causes a problem. And the other thing is then you can't burn as well because people don't want to have smoke coming into their homes. It may sound strange that the habitat for Venus flytraps needs to burn. Well, basically what burning does, it's a pruning technique. It removes the competitive vegetation. Flytraps like full sun, and they don't like a lot of competition from other plants. So in the natural habitats, regular burning cuts back the shrubbery that can overtop flytraps and stimulates the other ground species, like actually in some cases sundews and pitcher plants. So fire is an essential part of the natural habitats. In your own backyard you can try mowing and weeding. In the natural situation it's burning that's essential, and burning frequently is prevented in many habitats. So that's part of the missing factor in management of flytraps in the wild, is the ability to burn on a regular basis. So we now are really trying to work with habitat loss specifically in our outer coastal plain of the Carolinas. It's not as big a problem, but you can report poaching, and here's a telephone number that you can use. In the meantime, we're working as hard as we can to see the flytrap is protected. We have the ability to really work on our populations of flytraps to see that they persist and are not jeopardized by building right next to them or on top of them. So there's a lot that can be done, and there's a role for everyone. We're going to be talking today with a man who has actually spent a lot of time learning how to propagate flytraps. Now, flytraps are actually a flowering species, and they do produce seeds, but you can get adult plants much faster if you propagate them by vegetative means, and that's what the film following will show, is how this technique can work. Terry got his original plants from the North Carolina Botanical Garden and Duke Gardens. When you look for flytraps as your source of flytraps, make sure you find ones that are propagated rather than taken from the wild. If the ones have been dug, oftentimes there are a lot of weedy things with them, like grasses and maybe even a moss or two. What you want is a flytrap that it says on the box usually propagated, and those are mainly being propagated by tissue culture. And there are great big greenhouses out west, on the west coast I've been told, that do a tremendous amount of propagation. So do not buy flytraps that are suspect from dealers, or that you can easily tell that there's a lot of weeds in with the flytrap.
Here we are in North Durham in my backyard, and these are my Venus flytraps. I've been growing these off and on since I was 10. These are the product of about 12 years of growing. I scaled down to these insert pots that are much easier to manipulate and fill with soil, and they grow really well in these pots. These two here were divided 3 years ago, and they were small plants, very, very small. Now they have pretty much filled each container, and they are ready to be divided. Growth has started to occur. They've started to come out of their dormancy just a little bit. There's some new traps on these. There's a flower stalk here. And I can tell by the color that they're really starting to green up, and they're at that point where they need to be divided. Venus flytraps love room, and we're going to give them some room to grow in several new containers. Oh, look at that, nice little millipede in there. All right, so what I'll do later is I'll come back and fill this with fresh soil and put in other divisions in this pot, that'll grow along with these. So there's a lot of dividers here, lots of. I'm going to have 4 pots of divisions this year, Julie. I already pretty much just And these are the clumps that we just procured from the garden. And we're going to start transplanting these individual plants into this pot. Really, you just kind of dig in, grab a clump, invite your friends. This could take a while. There's a lot of them. But basically, these should just fall apart. You just take away some of the loose soil and these just tease apart. See how that just fell apart from this group? And it doesn't take any pressure at all. They just come right apart. If you find, these are the rhizomes, if you find that they're not teasing apart, you just leave it alone. That means it's fused and it'll be fine that way. It's just not going to give. But as you can see, this clump is yielding about 5 plants. These are larger plants. What we'll do with these is I like to dip them in some water, and what that does, it gives me a chance to see where the roots are. These have some fairly long roots here, and I'll make a hole in this pot. This pot has already been prepared. It's been wetted. It's been outside for a couple of weeks, so this soil is ready. It's not too moist. It's not too dry. It's just right. You want to level all that out before you start planting. I'll turn this around a little bit so you can see. But you want to make sure these roots are down, and just dig a nice deep hole to hold them in, and then just tuck the dirt in right beside of them. You want to cover up the white all the way up to the white tissue here, and just leave the green exposed. Just leave the crown of the plant. If you get to the end of your planting and you see some white kind of sticking out of the dirt, you just push the plant down a little bit. It's not going to hurt anything. And just keep on planting each individual plant. Now, since these are larger plants, these are more adult sized plants, I give them a little bit more room. I give them a couple inches so they can do their thing. But this kind of just cleans the roots off. And you just continue on until the pot is full. I'm going to grab a smaller clump so you can see how many plants actually come out of these smaller clumps here. Let's see. This is a good one. Okay. Now, as you can see, these plants, if given time, they're just going to keep crowding each other as they become adults. And this is a perfect time to divide these. Once again, the soil just comes off. I'm going to put these over here. The soil just comes away, and then the rhizomes just separate out, just like that. There's really no work involved. They just come apart, and you just kind of tease them apart, just like that. There's a little small one right there, and this looks like a lot of plants. Oh, it was. I thought it was fused, but see, those did separate. And what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to make sure that at least each rhizome has a root system, so that it'll take off once you get it in the soil. Here's a divided plant. It's got multiple nodes of rhizomes on it. This is a very healthy plant right here. And just, I want to dredge it in the water a little bit, and then I want to plant this right over here. And I want to make sure that all the white tissue is below the soil level and all the green is above. So what I'll do is I'll hold the plant, and this won't hurt it at all. I'll just take all the leaves of the plant and kind of hold them upright, kind of pull them up, and then dip them so that I can have all the tissue above ground, and just put the rhizome in the soil. So one of these pots probably holds about 100 plants. Now, if you're doing the really, really small ones, you can get 200 or more in these pots. You'll just make that many holes and plant that many individual plants. And in 3 years, they will be this size, if not bigger. So that's, it's kind of like compounding interest. It's like the more you have, the more you're going to get, and it just keeps on going that way. And since these things have lived, I think I've got, most of my plants have lived for at least 10 years or more. You're going to continue to get more plants because they just don't die out. They can live 20 years, and given the right care. This is where you find yourself with this many plants, because they just take off like weeds. And if you are willing to put in this kind of effort to continue to propagate them, they're going to reward you with continued life and continued vigor. So that's how this came to be out here. Once you have a full pot of these plants, what we'll do is we'll take an X-Acto knife, and what you'll do is you'll cut some holes in the bottom here. And you want to, Venus flytraps, they like moisture, but they don't want to be sitting in water. They don't want their roots to be standing in the water. So in order to lower any water table, once they're outside, it's going to rain on them. And some days it can rain really heavy. Some days you don't get as much rain. But when it rains really heavy, you don't want these pots waterlogged. So in order to keep them from being waterlogged, I'll just poke some holes in the side here, about midway. And I just make a little triangular cut here, just like that. You can see the light coming through there. I'll put about 4 in there. That way, if it's you have a really heavy downpour and you're out of town for a week, they'll be fine. The bottom will be still wet, the top will still be wet, but any standing water will be way down here. So about mid-April toward May, you're going to get hundreds of flower stalks from these pots. And there's 2 ways to do that. You can either let the flowers go to seed, which will drain the plant of its growing potential, or you can snip the flowers off once they get to about 6 inches. You can snip the flower stalks off right near the plant. Now there's another school of thought that if you wait till they're 6 inches or 8 inches tall and grasp the flower stalk at the rhizome and twist and get some of the white, it's kind of a whitish pinkish material, the plant material at the very bottom of the rhizome. If you can twist that at the rhizome, that vegetative part is very easy to propagate. I've done it before. It's kind of a slower process, but if you take all these flower stalks and then lay them on their sides in a pot and just cover them with an inch of soil, in about 3 months they will form these nodes at the very bottom and some roots, and those nodes will turn into plants. It's kind of a complicated process, but it's worth trying it because you're not wasting any. You're only gaining from this, because otherwise you'll be throwing these stalks away. So it's worth it for someone who's interested in that to try that. It works. But the caveat is when you're twisting that plant at the rhizome, I'm not sure if it does any damage to the plant or not. It's a tricky business. You can literally pull a plant out of the ground by doing that. So you have to stabilize the plant and really be gentle doing that. I'm starting to be on the side of just snipping at the plant, at the base of the plant, and just not dealing with the flower stalks for reproduction, because this is enough reproduction to handle on its own without having to reproduce with the flower stalks. So to talk about the soil, this soil is created once a year for this purpose only, for repotting, and it's the name brand of the peat moss. It's sphagnum. It's in a 3 cubic yard bundle. You've probably seen them. It's a square pack, and it's really dry. It's almost hydrophobic. It's 3 cubic feet of the peat. It's called Premier Peat. It's from Canada. I'll take that, put it in the wheelbarrow, and add 2 bags of paving sand. Now when you mix all this together, it's very dry, and it takes a lot of water to wet it. That's why you have to start about a week or 2 in advance when you're making the soil. It takes a lot of water to wet it. You have to be patient and really churn that around in the wheelbarrow with the shovel, mixing all the sand and the peat. But it's basically 3 cubic feet of peat and 2 bags of paper sand. And I use distilled water or rainwater or reverse. You can use reverse osmosis water, whatever you have. But the thing about water is a lot of people use rain barrels to catch water for their plants. That doesn't work well for Venus flytraps. Asphalt and petroleum products that are up on your roof will only contaminate the water that goes to those rain barrels. So I never use that. I have 2 rain barrels that I use to hold my water, but I collect water in wading pools. When I know it's going to be a downpour, I'll drag the wading pools out. It rains, I scoop the water up in 5-gallon buckets and transfer it to the rain barrels. When it snows, I'll fill the pools up with the snow and let that melt and put that in the rain barrels. All the water that these get have either been distilled water from lugging jugs and jugs and jugs from the grocery store at $1 a jug. I spent hundreds of dollars just using distilled water for a long time. Then I found out I could just use the rainwater, and I found a system that works best for me and for the plants. So this is all rainwater from rain barrel from wading pools and not the roof.
Terry has a wonderful technique that you've just seen in this video. His large pots that he's been producing for some years, he's donating to several good causes. Because we don't know where these plants came from to start with, other than the Botanical Garden and Duke Gardens, we don't want to put them have come from that area to start with. However, the pots themselves are a wonderful teaching tool, and he's donated pots to the Sioux and Waccamaw Indians for their demonstration area where they're going to be having a flytrap garden. And they also to Moores Creek Battlefield, which at one time had fly traps, but they were flooded out during a hurricane. So these pots are getting around the country to be used as teaching tools, and hopefully they can be protected so no one will poach from those pots.